Frenzy. Frenzy is a 1972 British thriller film directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It is the penultimate feature film of his extensive career. The screenplay by Anthony Shaffer was based on the 1966 novel Goodbye Piccadilly, Farewell Leicester Square by Arthur Laburn. The film stars John Finch, Alec McCowan, and Barry Foster, and features Billy Whitelaw, Anna Massey, Barbara Lee Hunt, Bernard Cribbins, and Vivian Merchant. The original music score was composed by Ron Goodwin. The plot centers on a serial killer in contemporary London and the ex-RAF serviceman he implicates. In a very early scene, there is dialogue that mentions two actual London serial murder cases, the Christie murders in the early 1950s and the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888. Barry Foster has said that, in order to prepare for his role, he was asked by Hitchcock to study two books about Neville Heath, an English serial killer who would often pass himself off as an officer in the RAF. Frenzy was the third and final film that Hitchcock made in Britain after he moved to Hollywood in 1939. The other two were Under Capricorn in 1949 and Stage Fright in 1950. There were some interior and exterior scenes filmed in London for the 1956 remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much. The last film he made in Britain before his move to the United States was Jamaica in 1939. Frenzy was screened at the 1972 Cannes Film Festival, but it was not entered into the main competition. Plot. Set in the early 1970s, the plot centers on a serial killer terrorizing London by raping and then strangling women with a necktie. Bob Rusk Barry Foster, a Covent Garden wholesale produce merchant, is the murderer. However, circumstantial evidence, partially engineered by Rusk, will implicate Rusk's friend Richard Blaney John Finch, who becomes a fugitive attempting to prove his innocence. Richard Blaney, a recently discharged squadron leader of the RAF, gets fired from his job as a bartender. He laments his loss with his friend Bob Rusk, who runs a fruit stand. Rusk consoles him by giving him some grapes and a tip on an upcoming horse race, but Blaney has no money to bet. He visits his ex-wife Brenda Barbara Lee Hunt, who runs a successful matchmaking agency. He complains loudly about his situation. Brenda, embarrassed, sends her secretary out for lunch. Shortly after Blaney leaves, Rusk, whom the agency has turned away because of his creepy sexual proclivities, comes to complain. Finding Brenda there alone, he rapes her and then strangles her with his tie, revealing that he is the serial killer whom the newspapers are calling the necktie murderer. After Rusk leaves, Blaney arrives, hoping to visit with Brenda again, but he finds her office locked and gets no response when he calls her name. The secretary, returning from lunch, sees Blaney leaving. When the murder is discovered, Blaney naturally becomes the number one suspect. Blaney meets up with Barbara Babs Milligan and Massey, his former co-worker at the pub, and convinces her that he is innocent. The two visit a hotel, where they make love and then narrowly dodge the police. They appeal to one of Blaney's RAF buddies for help, but the man's wife refuses to let him harbor a fugitive from justice. Blaney persuades Babs to get his belongings which he had left at the pub, so that he can flee. There, Babs runs into Rusk, who offers to let her use his flat for the night. After leading her there, he rapes and murders her. He hides her body in a sack and stows it in the back of a lorry hauling potatoes. Back in his room, he discovers that his distinctive jeweled tie pin with the initial R is missing and realizes that Babs must have torn it off while he was strangling her. Knowing the tie pin will incriminate him, Rusk goes to retrieve it, but the lorry starts off on its northern journey while he is still inside. In spite of the bumpy ride, he manages to retrieve her body from the sack. Rigor mortis has set in, and Rusk is forced to break Babs' dead fingers, one by one, in order to retrieve the pin. Disheveled and covered in potato dust, he gets out when the lorry stops at a roadside cafe and manages to return to his flat at Covent Garden. When Babs' body is discovered in the lorry, Blaney is suspected of her murder as well as Brenda's. Blaney, unaware that Rusk is the actual murderer, turns to him for help. Rusk offers to hide Blaney at his flat and then tips off the police. In the face of this treachery, Blaney realizes that Rusk must be the murderer. At the trial, the jury finds Blaney guilty, but during the trial, and while being led away to prison, he loudly protests that he is innocent and that Rusk is the real killer. Chief Inspector Oxford Alec McCowan reconsiders the evidence and quietly begins investigating Rusk. He discusses the case with his wife Vivian Merchant while trying to avoid eating the disgusting food she has learned to prepare in an exotic cooking course. Blaney, now in prison, vows to escape and avenge himself on Rusk. He deliberately injures himself and is taken to the hospital, where his fellow inmates help him escape the locked ward. He goes to Rusk's flat and finds that Rusk is not there, but finds another dead woman in his bed with his necktie still around her neck. Inspector Oxford, who has anticipated that Blaney would go after Rusk, arrives to find Blaney with the dead woman. Just as Blaney begins to protest his innocence, the two hear a loud banging noise from the stair. The inspector hastily conceals himself, and Rusk enters, dragging a large trunk into the flat. Oxford reveals himself. Riley shakes his head at the trapped Rusk and remarks, "Mr. Rusk, you're not wearing your tie." Cast notes. Alfred Hitchcock's cameo appearance can be seen 3 minutes into the film in the center of a crowd scene, wearing a bowler hat. Teaser trailers show a Hitchcock-like dummy floating in the River Thames and Hitchcock introducing the audience to Covent Garden via the fourth wall. Michael Caine was Hitchcock's first choice for the role of Rusk, the main antagonist, but Caine thought the character was disgusting and said, "I don't want to be associated with the part." Foster was cast after Hitchcock saw him in Twisted Nerve, which featured Frenzy co-star Billy Whitelaw. Vanessa Redgrave reportedly turned down the role of Brendo, and Deep Red's David Hemmings, who had co-starred with Redgrave in Blow Up, was considered to play Blaney. Helen Mirren, who later in life played Hitchcock's wife Alma Rivell in Hitchcock, met with the director to discuss the role of Babs Milligan. Eventually she rejected the role, and years later said she regretted doing so. Production. After a pair of unsuccessful films depicting political intrigue and espionage, Hitchcock returned to the murder genre with this film. The narrative makes use of the familiar Hitchcock theme of an innocent man overwhelmed by circumstantial evidence and wrongly assumed to be guilty. Some critics consider Frenzy the last great Hitchcock film and a return to form after his two previous works, Topaz and Torn Curtain. Hitchcock announced the project in March 1968. Hitchcock approached Vladimir Nabokov to write the script, but the author turned him down because he was busy on a book. He then hired Anthony Shaffer. "It will be done comedically," said Hitchcock. The film starred relative newcomers in the lead roles. "I prefer a fresh face," he said. Shooting. Filming began in July 1971. Hitchcock set and filmed Frenzy in London after many years, making films in the United States. The film opens with a sweeping shot along the Thames to Tower Bridge, and while the interior scenes were filmed at Pinewood Studios, much of the location filming was done in and around Covent Garden and was an homage to the London of Hitchcock's childhood. The son of a Covent Garden merchant, Hitchcock filmed several key scenes showing the area as the working produce market that it was. Aware that the area's days as a market were numbered, Hitchcock wanted to record the area as he remembered it. According to the making of feature on the DVD, an elderly man who remembered Hitchcock's father as a dealer in the vegetable market came to visit the set during the filming and was treated to lunch by the director. No. 31, Ennismore Gardens Mews, was used as the home of Brenda Margaret Blaney during the filming of Frenzy. During shooting for the film, Hitchcock's wife and longtime collaborator Alma had a stroke. As a result, some sequences were shot without Hitchcock on the set so he could tend to his wife. The film was the first Hitchcock film to have nudity, with the arguable exception of the shower scene in Psycho. There are a number of classic Hitchcock set pieces in the film, particularly the long tracking shot down the stairs when Babs is murdered. The camera moves down the stairs out of the doorway with a rather clever edit just after the camera exits the door, which marks where the scene moves from the studio to the location footage and across the street, where the usual activity in the market district goes on with patrons unaware that a murder is occurring in the building. A second sequence set in the back of a delivery truck full of potatoes increases the suspense as the murderer Rusk attempts to retrieve his tie pin from the corpse of Babs. Rusk struggles with the hand and has to break the fingers of the corpse in order to retrieve his tie pin and try to escape unseen from the truck. The part of London shown in the film still exists more or less intact, but the fruit and vegetable market no longer operates from that site, having relocated in 1974. The buildings seen in the film are now occupied by banks and legal offices, restaurants and nightclubs, such as Henrietta Street, where Rusk lived and Babs met her untimely demise. Oxford Street, which had the back alley Dryden Chambers, now demolished, leading to Brenda Blaney's matrimonial agency, is the busiest shopping area in Britain. Knell of Old Drury, which is the public house where the doctor and solicitor had their frank, plot-assisting discussion on sex killers, is still a thriving bar. The lanes where merchants and workers once carried their produce, as seen in the film, are now occupied by tourists and street performers. In a 29 May 1972 letter to the editor of The Times, novelist Lambourne said he found Hitchcock's production and Schaffer's adaptation of his book appalling, concluding finally, "I wish to dissociate myself with Mr. Schaffer's grotesque misrepresentation of Scotland Yard offices." Soundtrack. Henry Mancini originally was hired as the film's composer. If the same film was made 10 years ago, it would have had twice the amount of music in it, he said. His opening theme was written in Bassian organ and dant, opening in D minor for organ and an orchestra of strings and brass, and was intended to express the formality of the grey London landmarks, but Hitchcock thought it sounded too much like Bernard Herrmann's scores. According to Mancini, Hitchcock came to the recording session, listened a while and said, "Look, if I want Herrmann, I'd ask for Herrmann." After an enigmatic, behind-the-scenes melodrama, the composer was fired. He never understood the experience, insisting that his score sounded nothing like Herrmann's work. Mancini had to pay all transportation and accommodations himself. In his autobiography, Mancini reports that the discussions between himself and Hitchcock seemed clear, and he thought he understood what was wanted, but he was replaced and flew back home to Hollywood. The irony was that Mancini was being second-guessed for being too dark and symphonic after having been criticized for being too light before. Mancini's experience with Frenzy was a painful topic for the composer for years to come. Hitchcock then hired composer Ron Goodwin to write the score after being impressed with some of his earlier work. He had Goodwin rescore the opening titles in the style of a London travelogue. The director had heard his score for the Peter Sellers sketch Balham Gateway to the South. Goodwin's music had a lighter tone in the opening scenes and scenes featuring London scenery, while there were darker undertones in certain other scenes. Reception. Frenzy received positive reviews from critics. Vincent Canby of the New York Times called it a passionately entertaining film with a marvelously funny script and a superb cast. He put it on his year-end list of the 10 best films of 1972. Variety also posted a rave review, declaring ingeniously fresh storytelling ideas, stamped with the same mischievous, audacious, and often outrageous mixture of humor and suspense that first made him, and later sustained him, make the universal release one of Hitchcock's major achievements. Roger Ebert gave the film his highest grade of 4 stars, calling it a return to old forms by the master of suspense, whose newer forms have pleased movie critics but not his public. This is the kind of thriller Hitchcock was making in the 1940s, filled with macabre details, incongruous humor, and the desperation of a man convicted of a crime he didn't Penelope Gilliatt of The New Yorker wrote of Hitchcock that we are nearly back in the days of his great English films, adding he is lucky to have been able to draw on Anthony Shaffer to do Frenzy's sly screenplay, not to speak of a cast of first-rate, well-acquainted actors pretty much unknown outside England, so that audiences have no preconceptions about who are the stars and therefore Kevin Thomas of the Los Angeles Times called the film Alfred Hitchcock's best picture in years, with all the marks of work by a master at his craft and at his most assured. Time magazine printed a very positive review of the film, in case there was any doubt. Back in the dim days of Marnie and Tapas, Hitchcock is still in fine form. Frenzy is the dazzling proof. It is not at the level of his greatest work, but it is smooth and shrewd and dexterous, a reminder that anyone who makes a suspense film is still an apprentice to this old master. In its 2012 review, The Guardian called Frenzy a complex and gripping thriller, praising the film as a rich tapestry of suspense and a masterpiece. Some reviews were more mixed. Gary Arnold of The Washington Post wrote that the film has a promising opening sequence and a witty curtain line, but the material in between is decidedly pedestrian. The reviewers who've been hailing Frenzy as a new classic and the triumphant return of the master of suspense are, to put it kindly, exaggerating the occasion. It kindly exaggerating the occasion. Jin, 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 jin. If this picture had been made by anyone else, it would be described, justly, as a mildly diverting attempt to imitate Hitchcock. The Monthly Film Bulletin was unsure what to make of the picture, noting an old-fashioned air to it that seemed to suggest that Hitchcock's return to England signaled a regression to an almost pre-war style of filmmaking. It concluded, for all its apparent awkwardness of script and characterization, John Finch especially can make little of Shaffer's anemically written hero. There is enough in Frenzy to suggest that, after the routine critical dismissals, it will repay serious assessment. Frenzy ranked 14th on Variety's list of the big rental films of 1972, with rentals of $6.03 million in the United States and Canada. The film was the subject of the 2012 book Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy, the last masterpiece by Raymond Forey. Frenzy currently holds a 90% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 92 out of 100 based on 15 critics, indicating universal acclaim. Accolades.